I'd like to call this meeting to order on March the 20th, 23. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ottawa, and Mississauga peoples. Confirmation of the agenda, that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby accepts the agenda for March 20th, 23 council meeting as presented. May I have a mover? Councillor Whitfield, Councillor Wright, all in favor? Carried. Disclosure of pecuniary interests? Seeing none. Number 4, public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to an item of business on the agenda for 2 minutes. Please give your name and the business on the agenda that you're talking to, and also your municipality or address. Is there anybody from the public? Okay.
My name is Sheila Willis. I live at 227 Minnie Street. I know this is not on the agenda, but on March the 6th and the 7th, there was 230 loads of dirt taken out of the old trailer park. If any one of you drove out to the dump like I did and saw the crap that was being dug out of there, and you can tell me that there was an environmental study done on this place? Like, you don't do an environmental study with a round mouth shovel, and that's exactly what was done down there. That is not right. So now, all that crap is out at our landfill site because it was covered up by everybody. I called people on the council. I talked to one, they put me on to another. I talked to that person, they put me on to another. Nobody could give me answers.
Okay.
You guys got to work together here.
Yeah.
It's the same way as on the 6th meeting,
Thank you.
March the 6th meeting, when you talked about the taxes. Our Lions Club was up here, talked about taxes and stuff. Mr. Palmer sat there and told us.
That's enough, Sheila. Not naming people out, please.
Okay,
So,
so
I
people
hear-
on council sat up there and told us that we all pay taxes. Yes, we all pay taxes, I agree. But you know what? There's 2 or 3 up there that don't pay North Huron taxes. So maybe
Sheila,
they
that's
should.
enough, Sheila. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, seeing no more, we'll go to...
Wayne Evans, you can stand
Hey,
there and
excuse me, Sheila, enough.
you don't pay our taxes.
That's enough.
Maureen Hoff. I was the East Wabanach. I did see the loads and I wanted to question it. Why I live down that road. I hope you're planning on, if our well water has problems, you pay for it. My second question, is the $450,000 for the council chamber up there a done deal?
No, it isn't, so thank you for your time then.
Because I want to know, if you can get out of it, get out of it. We have downstairs and we have the hot stove lounge.
Okay,
Spend
thank
our
you.
money wisely.
Thank you. Consent agenda, that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby adopts consent item 5.1.1, and further that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives the consent items 5.1.2 to 5.3.4 for information. We have a mover and a seconder. I'll move. Thank you, Deputy Seconder. Councillor Van Hitterson. Does anybody like to pull anything? Go ahead, Councillor McBurney, and then Councillor Palmer.
Yes, 5.3.4, a letter from the municipality of North Perth. I would like to see us send a letter in support. That's in regards to the stop arm cameras on school buses.
Thank you, Mr. McBurney. Okay, that's been duly noted. Okay, Mr. Palmer, you had your hand up, please?
Yeah, I was just wondering, this is 532, the minor hockey letter. They're trying, I'm just wondering if anything if it can be relooked at, or if we can go anywhere with it, because they've offered some, they're trying. They've added some hours, they're trying to find other people. I'm just wondering, I just, it's good to come up with rules, everyone needs rules, but when there's a group that really tries or thinks outside the box just a little bit, it's nice if we can try something with them. So that's just my comment.
Thank you. That's been duly noted by CEO Evans. Go ahead, Councillor Wright.
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, it's, in a little way, it's a self-defeating situation, right? Officially, the ice doesn't go in, therefore, we don't get people to book it. Therefore, you don't get the usage that you might get, which would actually warrant putting the ice in earlier, right? So it'd be nice, I don't know if there was a way of keeping it open or keeping it available so that when people were putting interest in, they weren't turned away right away. And the other thing is, I kind of noted when I was going through the line by lines from Parks and Recreation, which was very well done, by the way. Total electricity expenditure for the Wingham Marina was only $78,000 for an entire year. And I think we were quoted to put the ice in earlier, it was going to be like another 25 or 30,000 for just a few weeks. So I'm not sure where that number comes from. It seems a bit high from the overall usage. So maybe we're not saving as much money as we think, but understand if you put the ice in September, it's going to be the most expensive month of the year too, right? So
I'm sure that can come out in the report, I'm sure. We'll see that. So is there anything else that people would like to look at? All in favor?
Well, so if I may, Your Worship, what I'm hearing is you're looking to pull two things from the consent agenda for further action. The first one being 5.3.4 to pass a resolution supporting the school bus stop arm cameras, and the second one being 5.3.2 to seek a follow-up report regarding what can be done with the ice in, ice out policy. So if that's the case, I would suggest that you pull those from the consent motion and deal with those after.
Okay.
So your mover of that motion is Deputy Reeve Falconer, and your seconder is Councillor Van Hittersum, so if they're fine with the changes.
Fine. Okay.
So your new motion would be that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby adopts consent item 5.1.1, and further that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives consent items 5.1.2 to 5.3.3, exclusive of 5.3.2 for information purposes.
Okay.
Yeah, so then if you want to
Okay.
call that vote.
Okay, call hands, please. Carried.
So then your next motion, I guess we'll deal with 5.3.4 first. So that motion would be that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby directs staff to send a letter of support to the municipality of North Perth regarding their resolution pertaining to school bus stop arm cameras.
Okay. All in favor?
Oh, so you need to move in a second.
Moving to second, sorry. Councillor McBurney, Councillor Whitfield. All in favor? Carried.
So then your next motion is dealing with 5.3.2, and that would be that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby directs staff to prepare a follow-up report regarding potential options with the ice in, ice out policy.
Okay. Do you have a mover? Councillor Palmer, Councillor Wright. All in favor? Carried. Okay, public meetings, hearings, and delegations. At this time, I'd like to welcome Christine Crane and Candace Cunningham to come forward for social research and planning Huron-Perth Public Health and Food Security.
So the PowerPoint's open on the bottom there, Kristen.
Okay. Excellent. So I'm Kristen Crane. I'm with the United Way Perth Huron as the role of Director of Social Research and Planning.
And I'm Candace Cunningham, a registered dietitian working with Huron Perth Public Health.
So we're here to speak to you about related research on food insecurity that we have both undertaken. So the Social Research and Planning Council undertook a survey in November of 2022 to capture the characteristics of food insecurity in the County of Huron and Perth County. And thanks to a lot of promotion and community effort, 740 surveys were analyzed, and the key findings will be presented to you today. Food insecurity is defined as inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. And 33% of participants are facing moderate or severe food insecurity. Only 3% of respondents felt that their income met their everyday needs. And unfortunately, we know when a household is experiencing food insecurity, they are already likely struggling financially to cover other basic living expenses. Within the survey, the main source of household income for the majority of respondents was full-time employment. So 62% of people who are facing food insecurity are employed full-time. Provincially, this number is 48%. So do the incomes of our survey participants meet their needs? The answer is no for 37% of participants. So the data that we collected demonstrates that the wages in our region are not sufficient to meet basic needs. 81% of the most common jobs in Perth and Huron are below $25 an hour, and this is based on 2020 data. So we know that food insecurity is solved by increasing incomes to a livable wage and providing a basic guaranteed income to meet all the basic needs of individuals. Our survey found that 88% of people have sacrificed the household budget to pay for other living expenses. And within that, the most common expense that has forced households to reduce their food budget is rent or mortgages, with 67% of respondents, followed by transportation and utilities. Households living on low incomes struggle to pay the rent and bills and food. Food budgets, because they're flexible, are sacrificed to pay other bills and expenses. "36% of respondents said that it was often the case, and 44% it was sometimes the case, that they could not afford their balanced meals. 9% of participants said that they had to cut the size of their children's meals, or their children had to skip a meal almost every month because there was not enough money to buy food. We also asked if people ever had to go an entire day without eating because there was not enough money. 19% said this happened almost every month, that they're going an entire day without eating. And I want to draw your attention to this statistic. 3% of our respondents said that their children had to go a whole day without food almost every month, and 7% said this happened some months. There are many, many households in our region with children who are going an entire day without eating.
When we look at the provincial and national data, we know that in 2021, approximately 16% of households were food insecure. When we look locally, we know that 14.6% of households in Huron and Perth are food insecure. And I do want to note that the stat before the pandemic, so the stat in 2017, was noted at 11%. So there is quite an increase from pre-pandemic to now. Despite significant evidence that food insecurity is an income problem, responses in Canada continue to focus on food provisions, with the most emphasis on food charities. There is a huge difference in the number of households experiencing food insecurity and the number of households who rely on food banks for food. In 2012, there were 5 times more people living in a food insecure household compared to those who used food banks to access food. And more recent data from 2015-2016 suggests that it's actually up 7 times. Food banks are often the last resort for people to obtain food. Most ask for financial assistance from family or friends, or will miss a payment before they are forced to use a food bank. While food banks do provide temporary relief for those who access, there is no evidence that it's a solution to food insecurity.
Locally, almost 50% of our respondents had never used community food programs, and those could be food boxes, community meals, food banks, food pantries. And so this is consistent with the other national studies that Candace has spoken about. Mental health. Let's shift things a little bit here. 48% of our respondents had often been in situations where they had run short of money and had to sacrifice their food budget. So what implications does this have for mental health when you have inadequate food supply?
So the risk of experiencing depression, anxiety disorder, mood disorders, suicidal thoughts increase with the severity of food insecurity for both adults and youth. During childhood, it can lead to problems such as hyperactivity and inattention. Mortality is the most serious health consequence. Severely food insecure adults die an average of 9 years earlier than adults who are food secure. Nearly 50% of adults who live in severely food insecure households report delaying, reducing, or skipping prescription medication to manage their health conditions because they cannot afford them, not to mention that those who follow a particular diet to manage their health needs can be costly. Food insecure individuals are more likely to get admitted into acute care and have longer hospital stays compared to those who are food secure. Living with severe food insecurity costs our healthcare system over $2,000 per year per person more compared to those who live in food secure households.
So our local data shows that 38% of participants report facing physical and mental challenges, followed by relationship issues at home for 31%, and barriers to moving forward with their lives, and low productivity at work or school.
So now we're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about the Huron-Perth Monitoring Food Affordability Report that was released last year. So to monitor food affordability, Huron-Perth Public Health surveys the price of food from grocery stores across the 2 counties using a survey tool called Monitoring Food Affordability. This was previously known as the Nutritious Food Basket. We calculate the cost of 1 week's worth of groceries. In 2022, this tool was updated to reflect the new Canada's Food Guide recommendations. Unfortunately, due to this, the results cannot be compared to previous years because, like I said, it's a new survey tool and it was also a pilot test. The survey is conducted by pricing 61 food items using the lowest available cost in 6 area grocery stores and calculating the average retail price. A few limitations to keep in mind about this tool is that it assumes that people have the time, the skill, the equipment needed to cook these foods, and it does not include prepared food, convenience food, or household non-food items such as toiletries. Additionally, this is not to be used as a budgeting tool. So now when we look at the results, when we read down the left-hand side of the table, you're going to see 3 or 4 different income scenarios. So all of these scenarios include children living in various households with different income sources. A family of 4 here is 2 adults, 2 children. So across the top of the table, you'll see monthly income, monthly cost of rent, monthly cost of food, and then the funds remaining after paying for just rent and food. So from this chart, you can see that a household with children receiving Ontario Works has much less money remaining at the end of the month, which would be have to put towards heat, hydro, if it's not included in their rent, along with childcare, clothing, transportation, school supplies, and anything else one may need to purchase throughout the month. And again, I do want to note that this costing tool does not include laundry detergent, soap, toilet paper, things like that, and so that would also have to come out of the funds remaining. So here are 4 different scenarios. The table is set up the same way. It just has households without children. So from this chart, you can see that individual receiving social assistance is already in debt after paying for just food and rent. So this is leaving no money left over for additional expenses. However, you can also note that the other 2 scenarios here aren't living much better. And I do want to draw your attention to the single person on Ontario Works renting a bachelor apartment. A bachelor apartment is nearly impossible to find in Huron and Perth counties. So therefore, they would either need to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, which you can see that the rent is even more, putting them further in debt, or they would be forced to rent a 2-bedroom and share living expenses with a roommate. So the results from the income analysis using the scenarios you've just seen are communicated in various ways across the province. Public health dietitians can engage in any or all of these activities, and I just put up an image on this presentation to show one way that Huron Perth Public Health has disseminated the data. Furthermore, to advance work public health dietitians do with modern food affordability, Ontario Public Health Dietitians released a position statement on responses that various partners can take to address food insecurity. This position statement has been endorsed by a variety of organizations and individuals, which includes the Huron Perth Board of Health.
So now to speak about some of the potential solutions for food insecurity. So a living wage is what is calculated on an annual basis, and Social Research and Planning Council contributes to this. And we calculate the actual costs, some of the things that Candace has shared earlier. And in 2022, the living wage for Perth and Huron region was calculated to be $20.70. The living wage is the hourly wage a worker needs to earn to cover their family's basic everyday expenses such as food, housing, utilities, childcare, transportation. And people who are paid adequately, we know, have improved nutrition and better health. And they're no longer forced to have the stress of having to choose between paying the rent or covering the bills or buying groceries. So we invite you to become a living wage employer as North Huron and to promote it to local businesses. And there was just good news last week that a local business, Brightspan, has been the newest certified living wage employer for our region.
And a few more recommendations your council can do is to advocate for federal, provincial government policies and programs to ensure an adequate income for Canadians, such as a basic income guaranteed, social assistance rates indexed to inflation, or a living wage, which you just heard about. You could also organize or volunteer at a local free income tax clinic, or you can offer free sports and recreation activities to families in the region. The latter two simply just provide more funds for families to use towards nutritious food. So to help you get started with this work, we actually wrote a letter to the Government of Canada on your behalf, which is attached to the cost of eating report that you may have seen earlier, that you can simply sign and send to advocate for basic income. So in case folks aren't aware what basic income is, it's an unconditional cash transfer from the government that enables everyone to meet their basic needs, allows them to participate in society, and to live a life without dignity regardless of their work status. A guaranteed basic income takes into account other incomes one is guaranteed to receive and supplements them with the remaining. Therefore, if you have sufficient income from other sources, you do not receive a payment. At times, we may be all forced with financial risks, so this can allow all of us to meet our basic needs, participate in society, and live with dignity throughout our lives. There has been multiple pilots across Canada, which has shown how successful basic income is. One closest to us was implemented in Hamilton, Brantford, and Brant County, and despite it only being implemented for 1 year, we found that participants experience a decrease in food insecurity, improvements in mental and physical health, which we've talked about, and even a decrease in alcohol and smoking. There's often a misconception that providing a basic income may deter people from working. However, in this pilot, only a small number actually quit their jobs. Those that did either went to school to get better education or to find a better paying job.
Thank you. And through you, Reeve, if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, ladies. Get the lights on there, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. One thing I did notice there, that their tax filing was provided here in different spots in Huron County and in town here is very appreciated seeing that, and yes. So are there any questions from anybody on the council, please? Oh, you did a great job showing us, and lots of pictures there and diagrams there for us to look at. Very good. Really appreciate you coming. And if there is any questions, they will get a hold of you. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. At this time, we'll ask our Viola special guide to come. There he is, Scott. Welcome. Scott Gowan is sort of in charge of our water and wastewater operations and maintenance, and we'd just like to see what you have for us, and I really appreciate getting your updates every month. You can sort of see, I always like seeing that our water is safe here, and it definitely lets us know one way or the other, and thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and I'd just like to thank Kylie Bruce, who helps put together those reports for us too, so that's great. I'm Scott Gowan. I'm the project manager with Veolia Water Canada. Tonight, I'm going to present on the water operations and maintenance activities for 2022. Yes, have to find the slide here. There it is.
It should be open at the bottom, Scott.
Okay. Great, yeah, so it's that. All right, so I'm going to start by going over the water operations and maintenance. So we utilize a preventative maintenance program for the routine maintenance. So we followed that throughout 2022. And in addition to that, we had a few other projects. Well 4 water line replacement. So we replaced the raw water feed that was running through the reservoir in Wingham. The water main to Hutton Heights was installed. We had some new fuel tanks installed for several of our generators, and we replaced a chlorine dosing pump at Wingham Well 4. For Blythe, again, we completed the maintenance program, and in addition to that, we also had new fuel tanks to install to bring things up to code for them as well. So we had our inspections, our annual MOE inspections, and happy to report that we received 100% compliance ratings for both Wingham and Blythe systems in 2022. Now, this slide just lays out our water taking limits for Wingham and how they compare with the amounts actually taken. So for Wingham Well 3, we were at about 25% of our peak flow was at 25% of the allowable capacity, and Well 4 was 24%. The combined day where both wells ran, we were at about 20%, and on average, we're at about 10% capacity. Shifting over to Blythe, for Blythe Well 1, we were at about 48% capacity, Well 2, 25% of the capacity, Well 5, 27%, and the combined flow data for the maximum day was 24%. On average, we are at about 12.6% of permit to take water capacity. So this is just a summary of some of the parameters we're checking for. So we took 477 distribution samples in 2022. Our average chlorine residual on those samples was 1.14 milligrams per liter. We had 364 treated water chlorine samples at Well 3 in Wingham and 344 at Well 4. For Blythe, we had 468 distribution residuals that averaged 1.16 milligrams per liter, and 364 treated water samples from each of the well sites. So in both Wingham and Blythe, we did have one case each where we had an adverse sample. It was a result of 1 CFU per 100 milligram or milliliter for total coliform. There was no needed action for that. These samples do happen from time to time. So what we had to do was resample and retest, as well as upstream and downstream from the location, and all of those results came back clear, so we were able to close those incidents off. So I'll shift to the wastewater side of things. So for Wingham wastewater, again, we did our preventative maintenance routine stuff. In addition to that, we had to do some clarifier flights and chain replacements. So those are some of our main treatment tanks in the process. In Blythe, similar, the routine maintenance was performed, and then we had another fuel tank replacement to get everything back up to code there for our standby diesel generators. Looking at capacity for wastewater, our daily annual average for 2022 was 2,049 cubic meters per day in Wingham versus our limit of 3,400. Our max peak flow was 5,306, which was over our peak flow limit for Wingham. In Wingham, we do have some lagoons that allow us to kind of buffer that, so it didn't really have a significant impact on the plant operations. In Blythe, our average flow was 475 cubic meters a day versus the rated capacity of 730. Our peak flow was 2,350 versus the peak capacity of 2,730 cubic meters a day. All right, so this is summarizing our quality. So we had 96.5% biological oxygen demand removal. The biological oxygen demand is basically the strength of the wastewater. So we took our raw water and improved it essentially by 96.5%. Total suspended solids, we removed about 95%. Phosphorus, 88%. And total ketone nitrogen, 95%. For Blythe, we had 98.5% biological oxygen demand removal, 98% total suspended solids, 94% for phosphorus, and 97% for total ketol nitrogen. So the next thing I'm going to touch on is bypasses for 2022. So for Wingham, there were no bypasses to report. Blythe, we did have 7 bypasses. They were all measured to be secondary bypasses. And what that means is we basically had to bypass the filtration step at the wastewater treatment plant. All of the bypasses were related to wet weather and or snow melt to some degree. The longest bypass was 38.4 hours, and it was in March. The total number of bypass hours was 152.65, and the total volume bypassed was 9,893 cubic meters.
Can I ask a question, Reeve?
Sure, yep.
I just wonder, what's the net result of when Blythe goes on bypass? Is it just a higher turbidity in the water that's released, or is there any other factors?
Yeah, there'd be higher turbidity and some of those other parameters like phosphorus would also increase during those bypass events. So it is getting the majority of the treatment, but it's not getting that final step of filtration just because the filters can't handle the volume that are being directed to them. So,
Okay, thanks.
yeah, no problem.
Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, through you, Reeve. Yeah, when does MOE jump in?
They'd certainly, obviously, like to see fewer bypasses. We get them involved with every bypass. We do have to notify the MOE. Because it's a secondary bypass, it's not quite as significant as a full bypass, like if we were bypassing the entire treatment system. But certainly they would obviously prefer there to be no bypass at all, for sure.
We're not fined or anything like that?
No, not currently. Yeah. All right, so this table here, it lists the number of events and volume by year. So I'm going to continue to the next table because it breaks them down individually here. So as you can see, 2022, we did have more bypasses than other recent years. But if you look at the historical average, I'd say we're around average since 2013. So this table is similar, it's just based on the volume of bypass. Again, recent 2022 was an increase from recent years. However, it's somewhat in line with the average we've seen since 2023. This table just is the hours of bypass, where the other two were flow and numbers. So again, similar story.
Reeve?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
How fast are you on deck then? Is there a bypass and nobody's there, or are you notified bang on?
We're notified within usually about an hour of needing to bypass. So the operator does actually have to open a valve essentially to do the bypass. So yes, we're there certainly within the hour of the initial high flow alarm, or it actually triggers like a high filter alarm because the water can't move through the filter fast enough, basically. So,
Okay.
yep. This is the historical bypasses by type. So the majority of these are related to either heavy precipitation, spring runoff, infiltration. Several of these would be applicable, like several of these causes would contribute to any single bypass at times. There have been in the last, since 2013, there has been a couple of other types, like mechanical failures and whatnot, but in 2022, they were all wet weather related. All right, and just to close things out, a couple of other comments. So the Blythe Sewage Treatment Plant is currently dechlorinating our effluent. This is being done under a temporary approval until a UV system can be designed and installed. And then one final point just regarding the Blythe water system. We continue to monitor the strontium levels there. It is remaining consistent. Communications on the effects of strontium was sent out to residents in 2021. And like I said, we continue to monitor that parameter.
Deputy Reeve?
Yes, through you, Reeve. On the sampling of that, there was a resident in Blythe, a doctor came forward at one of our other council meetings and stressed her concerns with the levels of the strontium, or however you pronounce that. Looking at the minimums and the maximums, we're well into the sampling level of, we're past like almost the 2/3 level of the maximum consumption rate. Is there a treatment for that available, widely known?
Yeah, there is treatment that can remove strontium. However, from my research at least, it's not typically used on the municipal level. So it'd be like an ion exchange, such as like a water softener, will remove strontium, much like it removes calcium and whatnot from and other minerals from the water. Reverse osmosis is another one, but these aren't systems you typically see on a municipal plant. They're more on a home level type of treatment. So
if I may follow up, so if there's the health maximum on it, but there's no health unit recommendations, at what point do the levels get to that something would be done, or is that not something? Is that something that we pass on to the homeowner to treat personally and not as a municipal well?
right. So yeah, right now I believe it is just there's only guidelines. There's not a maximum allowable concentration for Ontario drinking water. Basically, at this time, there's really nothing required to be done on it. Now, the strontium in Blythe is naturally occurring, so there's a little less risk usually associated with that as well. But yeah, that's something that we could look into further to get more information on. All right. Yeah, so that was actually the final slide. So if anyone has any other questions they would like to ask, I'm certainly open to them.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate that. As I say, we like looking at the metrics you put out to us each month, because you do want to know that you're drinking safe water there. And a good question from Deputy Reeve there. And if you could keep us up to date on that, would really be appreciated for sure. So any questions from the members? Go ahead, Councillor Wright.
Through you, Reeve, just curious, is there any noticeable difference in strontium levels or sodium levels between the different wells in Blythe, or are they fairly consistent?
They are quite consistent, actually. So well 1, 2, and 5 all have generally about the same amount of strontium and I believe sodium as well. I'd have to double check the numbers on that, but I think they're all relatively similar. I know for sure strontium, sodium, I'm not 100% sure that they're equal, but.
Yeah, so it seems like even drilling another well wouldn't provide a solution, because you'd be right into the same water table again.
Yeah, that's probably likely, yeah.
Thank you.
Deputy Reeve, go ahead.
Yeah, just a follow-up on that. I noticed that the testing for this substance was done in July 5th to the 22nd. As operational, that you say it's naturally occurring in the water, is there any circumstances where during the year that would be substantiated, like if a heavy rain, affects all the other systems as far as overruns and triggers in the system? I'm just wondering if that was done in July or if that was done in December, would those numbers be different?
I don't believe so, because it's a secure groundwater source, so it's not under the influence of surface water typically. So most likely not. I do know originally we were sampling quarterly for strontium, and there wasn't a significant fluctuation there. So that's where it was decided that we could reduce the sampling to annual, just because the numbers weren't fluctuating significantly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Any other questions from any of the members? Seeing none? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, thank you, Reeve. And this is a bit of off-the-wall one. I know all the residents in Blythe are on the system here, but a lot of them, or most of them, should have a pit in their basement, right? Sump pump.
Right, yeah.
Would it come out of the ground? Like, I know code says it has to be a lid on it, but a lot of them are older homes and probably don't. Are homeowners at risk?
You're asking about like the groundwater for strontium, or is this just for like groundwater infiltration?
Yeah, it's in the ground. It's coming into the pit sometimes, right?
Right. Yeah, so for like the sump pumps and whatnot.
From piping around, tubes around the house.
Right, yeah. So, in general, the sump pump systems would be to take excess groundwater away. So I'm sure quite regularly those pumps are running. Now, if those pumps were to stop running, there would be certainly a risk of flooding the basement or whatnot. But in general, it's going to reach the point of the water table at that time, and then stop at that point. So
I'm just worried about the strontium, though.
The strontium.
A bit.
Yeah, no. I believe I don't think there'd be a major concern there. The well water, it's getting its strontium from deep geological type deposits, so it's unlikely that it would be an impact on that water. So yeah.
Thank you. If no other questions, I just want to thank you again, Scott, for presenting this to us, and again, look forward to the good reports that keep coming. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much, and a lot of good questions, and I appreciate your time. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, at this time with Planner Holman.
So there is the recommended
sorry.
motion there.
Yes.
Your
Yes,
worship.
that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives the presentation from Scott Gowan, Viola Water Canada, regarding the 2022 annual activities review for information, and further that Council receives the 2022 annual and summary reports for Blythe and Wingham Water System for information, and further that Council receives the 2022 annual reports for the Blythe and Wingham wastewater systems for information, and further that the 2022 annual and summary reports for the Blythe and Wingham water system be available for the public free of charge and posted on the township website. You have a mover, Councillor McBurney, seconder, Councillor Whitfield, all in favor? Carried. That's 7.1.1, 2023-04, first draft amendment of zoning bylaw update. We ask Planner Holman to come and give us her presentation, please.
All right, thank you for having me, Council. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. So as mentioned, the purpose of my presentation and then the accompanying materials with my report are for council to receive the first draft amendment of the zoning bylaw review. And I'm council is welcome to ask any questions as we go through the presentation through the discretion of the chair. So just a reminder for the basis of the review. So council did provide direction in early February to begin the zoning bylaw review. So in 2022, North Huron also updated their official plan. So as part of that, we are also updating the zoning bylaw to conform with the official plan. Since the last update to the zoning bylaw, there have been changes to provincial legislation, the provincial policy statement, as well as the county official plan. The amendment is also informed by the housing-friendly workshop that council conducted with the planning department in 2021. The zoning bylaw also provides an opportunity for any housekeeping amendments or corrections. An updated amendment does include text and map changes to the existing zoning bylaw. So the first draft was included with council's package this evening. And again, I can certainly appreciate that it's a lot of material. So again, I want to emphasize this is a first draft, and there'll certainly be more opportunity to discuss this as we go forward. So just a refresher on the purpose of the zoning bylaw. So this is the primary tool that council uses to implement the vision in the official plan. So council will note that most of the highlighted updated amendments are based on the policy direction that was provided by council in the official plan in 2022. The zoning bylaw is the applicable law for building permits, so it'll specify which specific uses are permitted on each property in each corresponding zone. It contains zoning maps, so key maps, that outline where those zones are located, and as well it includes building provisions in terms of the size that you can build, things like setbacks. So that's the purpose of the zoning bylaw. In terms of a project timeline, so again, council initiated the process in February. Here we are receiving the first draft amendment. The next steps will be to have the open houses towards the end of April. So members of the public will be invited to those sessions. Throughout May, we anticipate continuing consultation with agencies and members of the public in revising the draft amendment. And then our goal is for June to present the revised amendment to council for their consideration on a decision. This timeline is, of course, dependent on the amount of feedback that we receive from members of the public, agencies, staff, or council. So as I mentioned, we do have 2 open house sessions tentatively planned for April. This is the time that we also did, it's the same week that we also did the official plan open houses, and we had really good turnout from members of the public, so we're hoping that this time also accommodates most people. For any individuals with any proposed mapping changes, we will be sending them individual notice letters in the mail. We also did something similar for the official plan amendment, and that was, we heard back from a lot of landowners through that approach. The planners will also be available by individual appointment, by request. And as I mentioned before, consultation with key agencies and in particular any key landowners that owned any future development lands will also be part of the process. So we have consulted with township staff a little bit and some of our agencies, but a lot of that consultation work will occur over the next month. So the overview of the key changes, so this is organized by each section. So for the agriculture zone, we do have proposed policies to permit additional residential units in the agricultural areas. So this does follow the approach in the official plan, but it does provide a little bit more direction. So it is proposed that on commercial scale farms, so these are typically zoned AG1, general agriculture, an additional dwelling unit is proposed to be permitted in either so a total of 2 additional residential units are proposed to be permitted. One could be located in the main dwelling, or one can be located in the detached unit, or both could be located in the main dwelling. We would like to include provisions that say that the detached ARU is to be located within 60 meters of the existing building cluster and utilizes the same laneway. So that follows the official plan direction that recommended that the dwelling units all cluster with each other. Oh, sorry. Presentation wants to go ahead. So there's a few different reasons why we wanted to do that, and one of the main reasons is just to minimize any potential impacts on neighboring properties from an MDS perspective with introducing these additional residential units. So we certainly want them to cluster in the same building area. For small agricultural holding zones, so this is our smaller lots where their main use is residential in agricultural areas, we are proposing that a single additional residential unit be permitted either to be located in the main dwelling or a detached structure, and again, provided that it clusters with the main dwelling, so within 60 meters and utilizes the same laneway. And then we are also encouraging that where possible, that they share services in terms of a well or septic. So that's what we have proposed. There also are, it would be expected that these buildings, it would depend if they were accessory structures or if they were in the main dwelling in terms of what provisions they would need to follow with things like setbacks to neighboring property lines. We also want to include policies to expand permissions for on-farm accommodation for farm labor. Right now, that permission is only allowed to mobile homes. For farm properties where they have a demonstrated need for farm labor, we would like to provide them more options to have this more in permanent residences, but with the same requirements that accommodations be clustered with the main building, and they utilize the same laneway. So continuing along with agriculture, we do have some updates to the minimum distance separation related items. So this is based on the updated guidelines for the province that gives some flexibility to the municipalities in terms of how they implement it. We want to clarify that MDS does not apply to agricultural, industrial, commercial uses, as well as on-farm diversified uses. So I do have later slides that explain what an on-farm diversified use is, but an example of this would be a market garden. And it is staff's opinion that these are uses that are being introduced into the agricultural areas as accessory uses to agriculture, so it's not our view that they should place a restriction on neighboring livestock operations. Although there is possible that people could cluster their on-farm diversified use with their existing dwelling, which would already have some restrictions from an MDS perspective. Sorry. So we also are saying that any cemeteries that are located in rural areas would be considered a type A land use. So there is still an MDS requirement, but it's less than the type B land use, which signals that it's a double distance. So our view again is generally these cemeteries are considered low visitation and they're already in the agricultural area. So we think that the type A single distance is appropriate here. Another change is the removal of the livestock limitations on small agricultural holdings. This is again informed by how we're not able to regulate the nutrient units. So we have removed that requirement throughout the bylaw. And then we have also provided direction that if you want to have an accessory building with livestock, there would be different types of zoning requirements in terms of setbacks than if you were to have a regular garden shed or a garage, for example. So in terms of on-farm diversified uses, this was updated in the recent official plan, and as well, we're similarly updating in the zoning bylaws. So just a bit of background, the province has provided guideline on diversified uses. So these can include things like a home occupation, a home industry. So these things are already permitted. So this would be something like a hairdresser's office or a small accounting business that you would have in your home and would be small scale. But they also include things like agritourism uses. So that would be something like a farm tour, for example, or a winery. Something like a value-added agricultural use would be something where you're processing and selling agricultural products on your property. So like if you're doing baked goods, or like, as I said before, if you have a winery, for example, where you're growing the grapes on your property, that's the intent of this, is that those things would be permitted. So in terms of the criteria for on-farm diversified uses, so the province does direct that they need to, I'm just going to go back to the other slide, that they need to be located on a farm. They need to be secondary to the principal agricultural use, limited in area, and compatible with surrounding agricultural operations. So the official plan has been written in a similar way, and similarly, we've written the zoning bylaw in a similar way. So I've included the full criteria that we have for the on-farm diversified uses. I will go over briefly, but I'm more than happy to go over any specific requirements. Again, we do have a piece that states that it needs to be secondary to the principal agricultural use of the property. It needs to be operated by the person residing on the farm, or that is part of the larger farm operation on the property. No traffic or safety concerns. Any relevant permits that they need for the health unit need to be obtained. In terms of the scale, smaller scale operations that are under 1 hectare in size would be permitted as a right under the AG1 zone, in that they're accessory to the main agricultural use, but any larger uses, we would direct them to the AG3 zone, which is that agricultural, commercial, industrial zone. This just includes some details on what would be considered in that area calculation. It's mostly any area where the activity is occurring, and that would also include any area for buildings or servicing. The zoning bylaw also provides a few more parameters in terms of how much area the buildings can occupy, things like occupancy, floor area, and that's, the zoning bylaw is intended to be a lot more specific in terms of these restrictions and allowing numbers there. This is what we have found has worked generally well elsewhere in the county, and does take into consideration some of the guidelines from the province of what is appropriate. Certainly, if you know, there is, of course, the opportunity to apply for a minor variance or zoning bylaw if these numbers don't exactly work out for the operation. But again, we want to provide at least some direction to limit the scale and ensure agriculture is still the main use. And yeah.
Go ahead, Councillor
Yeah,
Palmer.
Thank you. Through you, Reeve. Hey, Hannah. Just wondering the intent of the 50-kilometer radius.
Yes.
Now, is that to protect the local producers from bringing in something, say, from the Toronto food terminal type of thing?
Yes, so through the reef, so yes, so that's the intent of the policy, is that we want to provide opportunities for people to have retail of products that are locally grown. What we want to avoid is them importing items from generally outside the Huron County area, because those uses should be generally directed to general retail in town. It's really to provide that opportunity for people to sell local produce. So
Okay.
I would say, yes, that meets the intent.
And another one, Hannah, yeah, I saw the 120-person seated limit, and I got kind of fierce at home, only at home.
Yep.
But then you said that if you get a variance or something, then there's some leeway, right?
Exactly, yep.
Okay.
So an example of this that we've seen elsewhere in the county is a wedding barn, for example. And the challenge is, right, you have to put some sort of scale on it. Some building permits are measured in terms of that occupancy load. But of course, you know, if someone wanted to have a slightly larger operation, we would certainly work with them through the minor variance. But
Okay, good.
That's the intent, yep. And again, as I mentioned, MDS is not proposed to apply to on-farm diversified uses. Again, it's our opinion that they are new uses being introduced to the agricultural area, and those agricultural uses should take precedence. So in terms of other amendments, the natural environment, so as part of the official plan designation updates, we did update the designations in the rural areas between agriculture and natural environment. The intent of this, again, was to ensure that the update did reflect the actual features on the ground. We are proposing doing a similar update for the zoning to make sure that the zoning also does match the actual features on the ground. There is a little bit more specific detail in the zoning. So the zoning does mostly have 2 natural environment zones. NE1 is natural environment full protection. So that is areas where there are provincially significant wetlands. So we are required by the province to not permit any development in provincially significant wetlands. So that is why those properties are zoned NE1. All other natural features are proposed to be zoned natural environment 2, which is just the general natural environment zone. Sorry, I apologize, my slides want to slip ahead. They do have some restrictions on the development, but they may be rezoned if you wanted to permit something like a residential residence in that natural environment area. It would just require a rezoning, but it's certainly less restrictive than a provincially significant wetland, which does need to be NE1. And then we also have an update to the adjacent land setbacks and the general provisions. This is in accordance with the official plan as well as provincial direction. So we are required to, so adjacent lands is the buffer area from the natural environment features. So if you want to do development in the actual feature, oftentimes you may need to do an environmental impact study, or on occasion, our county biologist may go out to the site and take a look at the features and say, I don't think a full study is warranted in this case, but it's something that needs to be looked at. In terms of the adjacent lands, it's a similar consideration. It's just that development may occur within these setbacks, but it just might require a review to see if there would be any negative impacts. I will say in our experience across the county, most development that is within these setbacks, unless it's very close to the natural environment feature, we often don't end up requiring an environmental impact study after our county biologist looks at it. I would say that's the one advantage of having that person on our team is they can go and look there and see if it's reasonable to require this, versus if we didn't have that person on staff, we wouldn't have as much direction. So that's the intent of that requirement there. So in terms of the flood hazard, so our approach during the official plan was that in the urban areas, the land use designations did not necessarily account for the floods, but the flood area was applied as an overlay for more communication purposes. With the zoning bylaw, we do need to provide a little bit more direction because again, this is the bylaw that regulates any buildings. So Wingham, Hutton Heights, and Blythe are all in the 2 zone flood areas. And that mapping and those regulations are provided by the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority. So you have your floodway, which is the most hazardous part of the flood hazard. And in that area, MVCA and as well as provincial policy does restrict the development that can occur. So unless it's a structure that's needed for mitigating a flood or erosion hazard, it's generally not permitted in the floodway. In the North Huron context, a lot of the floodway, at least in Wingham, is along the Maitland, along some of the township recreational properties, but there are occasional areas which are already built up residential areas that are in the floodway. So in this area, they are still permitted to continue to use their existing structures and uses. Under the permitting system, which is a separate process by the MVCA, they are required to get a permit if they want to do any alterations to those structures. But what we don't want to have in these floodways is people building new residential dwellings or adding additional dwelling units, which would increase the risk to human life and property. So we've added in our zoning bylaw similar language to the MVCA. The intent of this, I would say, is more of a communication tool just to make it clear to landowners that they may be in the floodway and they do already have these restrictions from the MVCA. And also to make it clearer to our chief building officials that, you know, in these areas, they need to speak to the MVCA before they come get a permit. So that's the intent of that. There is what's called the flood fringe areas, which are the outer edge of the flood hazard. They are still in the flood hazard, but there's far less restrictions in this. And in this area, under the MVCA regulations, you may do development. You just may need to satisfy the requirements of their permit in terms of, one common thing is increasing the grade of the property or demonstrating that there's no negative impact. So in those areas where they're flood fringe, we're not proposing to change the zoning, but we are proposing to have an overlay on that on the key map. And I think that also offers the benefit to landowners so that they can be well aware if a property does have, is in the flood hazard, and as well as for our chief building officials.
Deputy
question.
Reed?
Thank you, through you, Reed. Hannah, is the overlay used, is it the new LiDAR, more accurate data that's being used for that overlay, or is it still the historic overlay?
So in Wingham, as well as Hutton Heights, it's the new data from within the last few years. That is the LiDAR, which is quite accurate. So that's another reason why it's good to update this. In Blythe, they do have the 2-zone flood mapping, which is generally quite accurate as well, but it's not to the extent that LiDAR is well, but it's certainly more accurate than some other areas across the county. So.
Thank you.
So we are proposing for those residential zones that already have development on them, that instead of being zoned FW floodway, that they just instead be assigned a residential special zone. That again, still emphasizes that they're in the floodway and, they have restrictions if they want to do redevelopment, but again, just makes it clear that they have existing structures and uses. So that's something we will be also, all those landowners will also receive a notice. And I did chat with the MVCA about their consultation process that they did over the last 2 years in terms of communication. So that'll be something that we can certainly provide an update to council on how that goes. But I think it offers the benefit to landowners that they're well aware that these CA restrictions may already exist on their property. So source water protection, we updated this as part of the official plan. We're proposing similar policies also be included in the zoning bylaw. These essentially match the official plan policies. So the first point is just saying that lands that are within a wellhead protection area where the vulnerability score is 10 and that are serviced by septic, it's just saying if you were to create a new lot in that area, it needs to be of sufficient size to meet provincial standards for that size. I would say, the areas that we have that are in the wellhead protection area score 10 that are serviced by septic systems. There's a very small area in Auburn and Whitechurch. So compared to other municipalities in the county, I don't see North Huron being as impacted by this. And then also at the request of source water protection, we have proposed to include these 2 policies that are in wellhead protection areas where the vulnerability score is greater than 8, just to again emphasize that some activities are already restricted, so the disposal of industrial or commercial waste, as well as the establishment of a municipal waste disposal site. Again, I think there's knowing where these are located. Again, so there is a wellhead protection area in Wingham as well as Blythe, as well as Auburn and Whitechurch. So Belgrave is no longer in the wellhead protection area, but I would say there's likely little possibility of these uses being proposed, but again, important to have that policies in. We also do have another general amendment that just speaks to if you have a plan of subdivision or condominium, that in the residential zones, any accessory uses to that plan of subdivision, so a park, a stormwater management pond, or any utilities or infrastructures are permitted in that residential zone without a zoning bylaw amendment. What we were finding is that on occasion, you'd have a plan of subdivision and they would rezone their stormwater management pond as open space. And then when they do the detailed engineering, they might find that they don't need as big of a space or as smaller of a space. So we're hoping to eliminate having to do that process first. And then the intent with that is that when we go through and do a housekeeping, then we will recognize those different uses. But just something to make that a little bit easier for folks. Throughout the bylaw, we also are proposing to remove the minimum ground floor area requirements. So this was usually used to say the minimum floor area for any dwelling units. We would prefer the approach of relying on the Ontario Building Code in terms of what those minimum dwelling unit sizes should be. So that has been changed throughout the zoning bylaw. As well with Bill 23, we are no longer, it specifically states that zoning bylaws are not able to have a minimum floor area size for any additional residential units. So I think it's clear that that's something that probably doesn't belong in a zoning bylaw. So in terms of the zoning map changes summary, again, this was included for in council's package. It does implement the natural environment and agricultural changes in the rural areas. Again, pending our consultation with landowners, these may change. So part of the official plan, we did do some site visits with landowners to look at the actual features on the property and make corrections accordingly. So there may be further changes. Again, implementing the flood hazard mapping. We also propose to clean up any existing special zones that are inoperable or redundant. There are a number of special zones in the current zoning bylaw that are quite outdated. You know, at one point, they might have done a zoning bylaw amendment to request relief from something many years ago, and now that is either currently permitted or proposed to be permitted. So just to clean up the document and make it a little less lengthy, we are proposing to remove some of these. But again, that'll be in consultation with landowners. We do pend further mapping changes, in particular pending our consultation with some key landowners. So those that have any future development land holdings, pending council's direction, we are hoping to reach out to them individually. And then again as well, if you have a zone change, you will receive a mail notice in the mail. So in terms of the housing updates, so to provide an overview for housing with full servicing, so this will be access to public, water, and sewage. We are proposing to update some of the definitions. So for a row house, or for multiple attached dwellings, we are proposing that those now be called a row house. So sometimes those are called townhomes, but just to make the terminology a little easier, introducing a definition for an additional residential unit and removing secondary dwelling units. We are proposing that the term multi-unit residential building be used in lieu of an apartment building, a stacked townhouse, or a condominium, just because, again, the terminology is confusing. We are proposing that the various different terms, so as a hospice, a group home, an emergency shelter, all be replaced with the term residential with supports. We do have proposed to increase the opportunities for denser forms of housing. Again, I have further details on that. And then we propose to permit supportive housing in all zones. So the intent of that is to get away from regulating the type of people that may live in those homes and more focus on like the actual form and the number of units. So is it a single detached dwelling? Is it an apartment building? That's the intent with that. I would say the only exception would be a retirement residence, just because those buildings usually require a lot more space and employees and are less so of a traditional residential use, I would say. So in terms of housing, the housing framework, so this is a repeat of the official plan direction. So right now there are 3 residential zones, so residential low density, medium, and high density. So the direction, the official plan for residential low density was that generally it would permit any residential units with 4 dwellings. So this includes singles, semi-detached, duplex dwellings. That means it has 2 units, one on the bottom, one above. A triplex and a quadruplex have 3 units and 4 units respectively, and it just means that the units can be on top of each other. And then row house dwellings. So that's proposed to have row house dwellings with 4 units. A converted dwelling is like, for example, a very large Victorian-style house, for example, that could be, because of the size of it, could be converted into multiple dwelling units. And then also permitting additional dwelling units. Medium density is proposed to include all the, everything that's permitted in the residential low density to provide flexibility, but it's also proposing to include multiple unit residential buildings. So this would be something like an apartment building. And the difference between these two zones, the key difference, again, the apartment building being the only exception for the medium density, is the height. So again, that's where we're trying to focus more on the form. So residential low density is to be 2 stories in height. Medium density, the official plan direction, is not exceeding 3 stories in height. But we do have proposed that the apartment building would be the only structure that would be 3 stories. And then all the other structures would keep their existing maximum height, which is 11 meters, which typically is 2 stories. Again, it depends on the design of the house and the peak of the roof, but those are generally 2 stories. A high density, the direction in the official plan is that this is for those multiple unit residential buildings, which may include apartments, stacked towns, accommodation geared to seniors, so those retirement residences, as well as row houses. So, and those are proposed to be 3 stories in height and greater. So my next slide has some more details on that. So I did go into some of these details before, but we're proposing residential low density generally will be up to 4 units. This is in addition to additional residential units. The height is proposed not to change for these, so generally be around 2 stories or 11 meters. Residential medium density, the difference is that there wouldn't be any limit on the row house dwellings. But again, in this case, the height would be the same at 11 meters. And then also permitting those apartment buildings to 3 stories. So right now, the 3-story maximum height apartment buildings, those are permitted in the R3 zone. The change is to propose that goes to 3 stories. Residential high density, so the difference here is, again, the row houses will be permitted to no unit limit. We are seeking direction from council in terms of their comfortability with the stories that would be permitted in the apartment buildings. I will note with the height for the apartment buildings, we do want to get some public consultation feedback on that, and then also consult with staff. Notably, we would like to also chat with the fire department in terms of fire rescue and if there's any concerns with the proposed height. But that would be something, either during this presentation or in a future draft, we'd be seeking direction from council from. It's staff's opinion that we would propose that this would go to 6 stories, and possibly also including a maximum building height there, just so you don't get too tall of a building, but you still get that density in terms of the actual stories and the units that you can have. So that would be council's direction, is that would be what would be permitted as a maximum height as a right in the residential high density zone. So that would be one that I would say certainly we would be welcome to further discussion on that. But I think we've seen in recent years that there's certainly interest in having those apartment buildings with higher stories. So, and we do feel that this is appropriate.
Can I ask you a question, Ruth? Yeah, just interested on the R2 medium density, specifically with apartment buildings, that the focus is on the height of the building, but not the size of the building or the number of units in the building. Is there any thought from a planning purpose to maybe, put that kind of a limit on it too, as opposed to, how big a 3-story building could be, number of units?
Right. So, in terms of the size, we do have things like setbacks and lot coverage, and something like an apartment building would be expected to have greater setbacks to your neighboring property owners than, a single detached dwelling, for example. In terms of regulating the number of units, the challenge that we have with that is zoning bylaws aren't necessarily supposed to regulate the interior features in terms of unit size. And I think another challenge would be, I also think there will be limitations on most sites in the R2 zone to limit the number of units in terms of how much available space you have, in terms of how much room you have for parking. But that's likely not the direction that we're intending to go. In the official plan, we do have minimum density targets for residential units, just to make sure that, there's an efficient use of land. But I would say those minimum density targets are quite generous in terms of they're not difficult to achieve. But no, there hasn't been any consideration in terms of the actual units. I would say it is difficult to regulate for that. We would probably want to focus more on, making sure setbacks are adequate to neighboring properties. And like I said before, the things like parking requirements might also limit their available space, so.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
And I think that's the one difference with something like, in terms of regulating the units for the row house, I think that's something that's a little bit clearer, because the number of units that you have has so much impact on the actual physical form versus an apartment building. If you have, if you have, for example, in a studio apartment versus a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, that's going to take up different space within the unit. So we would like to leave that up to the developer to decide, I guess, what works for them. But I think it would be a little bit more challenging in that case, so. In terms of, so in terms of implementing some of this intensification, zoning provisions as well as official plan policy, the county does have what's called the residential intensification guidelines, which are urban design guidelines for essentially any residential intensification properties. So with Bill 23, we do have some limited ability in terms of actually regulating design through site plan control. If it's 10 units or less, we don't necessarily have that control, but this is something we still certainly intend to use as a guideline for evaluating any other similar planning applications. And with any larger developments that are over 10 units, we would certainly expect that their site plan would take into account some of these considerations in the guidelines. So in particular for the higher buildings, things like ensuring that the impact of the shadow of the building on neighboring properties would be considered. In terms of parking requirements, we are proposing that these generally be reduced. So right now, the parking requirements will depend on the type of development that you have. So right now, 1 space is what's required for a single detached, semi-duplex, or an accessory dwelling. 1.5 space is required for a row house or multiple unit dwellings. We're proposing that all residential units, regardless of what form they take place in, be reduced to 1 parking space per dwelling unit. For the accessory residential units, Bill 23 requires that we can only require 1 parking space. So that's the one piece where there's not much flexibility. Our intent with this approach is that, developers are certainly able to provide additional parking spaces if they wish to. But what we were seeing is that a lot of the parking was one of the sole things driving the development, and certainly we want to make sure there's adequate parking. But, in our mind, if it's at the loss of some residential units, we don't think that's worth it. And we also think 1 parking space is adequate as a minimum. And again, I said, if a developer chooses to provide more parking spaces because they think that'll better appeal to whoever they're marketing their units to, then by all means, they're able to. We are going to permit tandem parking spaces for residential parking areas. So just to clarify that, so if it's on the same property, you can have tandem parking. And the thought is that any of the landowners, the tenants there would coordinate among themselves in terms of getting the cars out. For county housing corporation properties, so there are 4 properties in Wingham that are owned by county housing for affordable housing. in consultation with our folks at County Housing, most of these tenants do not drive or do not have any cars. So it'll depend on the building, but a lot of the buildings do not have their parking spaces being used. So we're proposing to reduce that to 0.25 spaces per dwelling unit. And that number would be rounded up if it was an uneven number. We also want to provide permission to allow off-site parking on neighboring properties, subject to a site plan agreement between those two landowners. So the site plan requirement would just ensure that parking can be provided on the other property. But this would only be for additional parking, not your required parking. So you need to still provide your required parking on your property, but if you but you're welcome to come to some sort of agreement with a neighboring property to use their parking, for example. So previously that was only afforded to non-residential uses, but we think it's also appropriate to allow that for residential properties. So,
A question,
Oh,
Reed?
yep.
What's the parking now for county housing? How many spaces?
So it's not specified in the zoning bylaw. Right now it is, because it would be an apartment building, it is 1.5.
I mean, just myself, I'd be concerned about reducing it to that amount. I would possibly see that as a barrier to low-income people, that if they own a car but need low-income housing for some reason and not actually have a parking spot available, it might actually be a barrier to access that housing.
Okay. Yeah, I certainly understand that perspective. And I think we may consult further with county housing, and we might bring that up to them. I can just think of one property in particular where if they were to redevelop, for example, I could see the parking being a hindrance to them, but that's something I can certainly discuss with them as well, because I can also understand that perspective too, right? So yeah, that's a really good point. In terms of housing with partial or private services, so this would mean any residential areas that are on private septic or and public water, or private septic and private well. So looking at the areas in Belgrave, Auburn, and Whitechurch for this, we would like to clarify that on these lots, that as a right, only a single detached dwelling is permitted. So there's a few different reasons for this. In these residential areas, you tend to have a lot of neighboring properties that all have septic systems. So we don't necessarily want to add any additional effluent or output that may negatively impact any neighboring properties or that landowner. But we still want to allow people to have single detached dwellings in these areas, but because of the servicing constraints, it's not generally an area where we would want to see intensification in terms of multiple units on the same property, unless, of course, they demonstrated that there would be no negative impact from a septic system perspective. So this is, so the province does have a guideline on this. So this is commonly sometimes referred to as a nitrate study. So essentially that study just looks at if you have a septic system and it's proposed to have this many units and this much effluent, is your lot size big enough to accommodate that by the time the effluent reaches your neighbor's lot line, that it's diluted to an acceptable point in terms of the nitrates. So generally in this case, the more units that you have, the larger of a lot size that you require. And again, it'll depend on the specific conditions that you have. So some other places in the county have demonstrated that you can have multiple units on private septic as long as the lot size is big enough. I don't anticipate this being as big of a concern in North Huron because your settlement areas that are on septic system for the most part are already built up, but we just want to provide that direction. For the larger lots, so over 2 acres, they are permitted an additional residential unit in addition to their single detached dwelling, so either located in the dwelling or in an accessory building. But for smaller lots, we are requiring that you would need to do that nitrate to demonstrate no negative impacts. So that's really what's driving the housing constraints in those areas. And then we also want to make sure as well that the lot sizes are big enough that you can have a conventional septic system, and it can be replaced in the future. Okay, so additional residential units. So these were sometimes referred to in the past as secondary suites or granny flats. We're proposing that the language of second unit be replaced with additional residential units. So an additional residential unit is required to have its own kitchen facilities, washrooms, and bedroom areas, so they should be able to operate independently as a dwelling unit. They can be located either within the main dwelling or in an accessory building. So we do have some special provisions for each of those circumstances. Each unit, we are proposing require a dedicated parking space. So again, Bill 23 only allows us to have one parking space for these units, and we're not able to also regulate the minimum building area. So we're proposing in that case that, again, we regulate where it's located and the size by things like setbacks and whatnot. And Bill 23 does require that on each fully serviced residential lot, that 3 residential units be permitted. So if you have a single detached dwelling, this would mean that you can have 2 additional dwelling units in your main building, or you can have 1 additional dwelling unit in the main building and 1 in an accessory building. So that's the direction in Bill 23. Also wish to clarify that if you're in a natural hazard area or the flood area, you would not be permitted to build a new additional residential unit because we are not looking to increase the possible hazard to human life. The county does have an additional residential unit guide that's geared towards landowners that does have more information on additional residential units and things to consider. And again, the following are just some examples of possible designs of what an additional residential unit in an accessory building could look like. So again, the permissions will depend on what your servicing type is. So where you're connected to full services, so in our urban areas, we're proposing a maximum of 2 additional residential units per lot, either located within or attached to the main dwelling, or you can have 1 in an accessory building and 2 in the main dwelling. For partial or privately serviced areas, as I mentioned before, the permissions for this will depend on your lot size and whether it's sufficient to accommodate the required septic effluent. But in this case, we are proposing that only 1 single additional residential unit be permitted. So Bill 23 doesn't require us to provide any additional residential units in these areas, but we do think if the lot size is big enough, it's appropriate to include that. So just moving along, so right now there are accessory building provisions for the residential areas, but they are only specific to things like if you have a shed or a garage. And we'd like to make some requirements that are specific to additional accessory buildings with additional residential units. So we've increased the rear yard and interior yard setbacks from 1.5 meters to 3 meters. The building height is proposed to increase slightly to 6 meters, just in case if someone wanted to have a unit above their garage, for example, provided it meets code and whatnot. But it's not proposed that height would be greater than the main building size, which right now for most low-density residential buildings is 11 meters. So for the building size, again, we can't explicitly regulate the total square footage, but we do want to have some sort of parent-child relationship with the accessory residential unit in the main building. So we are proposing that it be 75% of the main building floor area. So this is something we also want to get a lot of feedback from landowners. There have been some interested property owners on this, so we may reach out to them just to get their thoughts on this. And again, of course, council is more than welcome to provide input. But again, the point of this is just to have a greater setback than our accessory buildings that don't have an additional residential unit. So somewhat related, so garden suites. So Historically, garden suites were something that were permitted under the Planning Act, subject to, if someone wanted to have a garden suite, so this would be an additional residential unit that's in the form of a mobile home. So it would need to have its own kitchen, bathroom, bedroom facilities, but the intent is that it would be a temporary additional dwelling. So historically, under the Planning Act, applicants, if they wanted that, they would have to apply for a temporary use bylaw to council, which is a type of zoning bylaw amendment. And if council granted them that temporary use bylaw, they were permitted to have the mobile home for a period of 20 years, with the idea that after those 20 years, you would remove the dwelling. It does require under the Planning Act an agreement with the township that outlines 20 years, you need to remove the structure unless you apply for a renewal, and it outlines who would occupy that structure. So I would say generally garden suites are a little bit outdated. They've been in the Planning Act for many, many years. But with the additional residential unit provisions, we may see less of these types of applications. The only difference I would say, so the additional residential units, we anticipate most of them will be in permanent dwellings. But in terms of right now, if someone wanted a mobile home as an additional residential unit, they would need to go through the garden suite process. This is something that will require further consultation, but we, planning staff, are proposing that mobile homes also be permitted as a right as additional residential units. Of course, subject to requirements is the building code. There's also CSA standards for these mobile homes. So things like a travel trailer or a park model trailer would not be permitted in this case. But I think it would offer the benefit of no longer requiring the temporary use bylaw or agreements. So again, the agreements do take staff time. And any existing garden suites would be permitted to transition to permanent ARUs if they meet the zoning requirements. So often what happens with these garden suites is, 20 years passes and they come back for renewal every 3 years because they still have that need for that structure. So that's part of the reason why staff is proposing that these things be permitted as a right. There have been some landowners that are interested in having mobile homes as accessory residential units. But I think we would like to consult further with staff and members of the public on this, just because there may be some concerns in terms of aesthetic reasons. There may be a preference that we only permit permanent additional residential units. And across the county, some other municipalities have also considered these changes as well, and there's been mixed feedback. So that's something we can look into, and if council's interested, we can provide some examples of what these look like. In terms of the agricultural areas, we are proposing that mobile homes can be used as additional residential units, and that any existing garden suites be permitted to transition to permanent additional residential units. But I think in the urban areas, there may be more consultation needed. So the last thing I'd like to chat about is future residential development lands and whether there is desire from council for a pre-zoning approach. So this was one of the things that was identified in the county housing strategy for things to help facilitate residential development. So right now, council, the R5 zone is a special residential zone that permits a professional office. We're proposing that this, the lands that are right now zoned R5, that they still continue to have the same permissions, but that they be transitioned to a special R2 residential medium density zone, which would allow them the same permissions, but also provide them a little bit more flexibility in terms of things like additional residential units. And that the R5 zone then be proposed to be changed to the residential greenfield zone, and then that can provide the opportunity for us to consider this further. But that's just a proposed housekeeping item. So again, seeking council direction on this. So the pre-zoning approach. So for typically most lands that are large undeveloped lands in the township right now are zoned FD, which is future development. So essentially, nothing's permitted other than, maybe agriculture, cropping as an interim use. But these lands are often already designated residential in the official plan, so we know that we want to use them for residential development. But commonly, or previously, the intent was that when you come forward with a development proposal, then you would rezone your property to either low density, medium density, or whatnot, depending on your proposal. So it actually reflect your proposal. An alternate option that staff is considering is potentially pre-zoning lands. So that would look like we would reach out to specific landowners, see if they have any general thoughts for development on their property and whether they would be interested in this approach. And then staff would consider providing more specific direction to these lands and whether they're appropriate for residential low density, medium density, or high density. And then it would also provide an opportunity for staff to consider any site-specific considerations. So for example, if there's a property that's near a lot of existing single detached dwellings, we may be able to build into the provisions, for example, okay, the high density should probably be located on the further part of the property, or it has to maintain a certain setback to these single detached dwellings. But it does provide staff and council the ability to provide a little bit more specific direction on what we would like to see for that property, rather than the developer coming in with what they want, and then, council or staff potentially having to negotiate somewhere in the middle of what that property looks like. The pre-zones would have a holding on them. So the effect of the holding means that you're not able to do any development or get any building permits until such time that you request that the holding be removed. And that holding wouldn't be able to be requested to be removed until they did any of the required studies. So if they had any technical studies, those would need to be completed. Things like available servicing capacity would also need to be considered. So if there's no available water or sewage for a property, then the holding's not getting removed. So the lands that we are thinking of, they are larger lands, so they would require an accompanying planning application, so a plan of subdivision. So through that application process, there is opportunity to consider the specific development proposal. And then again, as I said, provisions would be prepared following consultation with landowners. Again, there may not be many landowners that, have a sense of what they want to do on their property, but that's a consideration. I do have some other notes on this, if you don't mind. So I think, and again, this is something council can consider, but, pending council direction, we would like to reach out to at least some landowners to see where they're at. I think also the zoning review also does provide a good opportunity to check in with these large landholding applicants, just to see what their thoughts are on their properties, or if they have any future plans for development. So again, I think some of the negatives to this approach is that, the zoning may be premature if you don't have a specific development concept, so we would hopefully write it with at least some flexibility. We would also be, if council wants to pursue this, we would also be seeking direction on public consultation for this. So typically, if you did a zoning bylaw amendment at the same time you were doing your plan of subdivision, all landowners within 120 meters would get a notice and would have the opportunity to participate at the public meeting. With the new pre-zoning approach, we would hopefully be looking to front end some of that consultation through the review process. So if council would desire, we would be willing to send notices to neighboring landowners. And again, there are some differences now with the plan of subdivision process and the zoning bylaw process in terms of appeal rights for landowners. So that's something else for council to consider with this approach. But we do think it would be helpful to help facilitate residential development. And then I think as well, the benefit of providing staff and council more specific direction on what we want to see for these properties. So things like medium density targets could possibly be better implemented through this. So that's something for council's consideration. I'm happy to get thoughts tonight, or this is something that can be brought back for council's consideration if they're interested in that. Some municipalities across the county are, as part of their reviews, they are interested in this. Others, not so much. So just looking for council's direction on that. And we can certainly, if there's interest, we can certainly come back with more information on, for example, what that would look like. So in terms of outstanding items, so there are some items that there wasn't that much specific direction provided in this first draft because they require further consultation with landowners, staff, agencies, or council. So again, as I said before, the assessment on future development zone lands that are designated residential and whether there's a desire for that pre-zoning approach. More feedback on the residential density framework, specifically the R3 multiple unit building height. In particular, as mentioned, I would like to consult with the fire department on that, but we would just, we just figured we would see what council's initial thoughts were. The removal of the proposed special zones, we will see what the feedback is from any special landowners, and then again, any further changes resulting from consultation. In terms of next steps, a similar motion is also included in the report and on the agenda. The next step is for us to really get into the heavy consultation period for this process. So individual notice letters are proposed to be sent to landowners at the end of this month, ahead of the public open houses being held in April. So the direction is that council receive the first draft amendment for information discussion, and then direct staff to circulate the public notices for the open houses to be held April 20th and April 21st, and then direct staff to provide notices to landowners with proposed zoning map changes. So I'm happy to answer any questions that council may have.
Yes, thank you very much, Hannah. There's a lot of information there, and maybe we might want to get a bit of a review back from you of your last thing that you're talking about. Might be appreciated, but I'll leave that up to staff to decide on that. And and at this time, are there any questions? I know on those two dates you gave us, they're going to be at Wingham first and then down in Blythe on the 21st, then I take it?
Correct, yes.
Just say where they are? Going to be.
Yep, so the Wingham one will be at the Hot Stove Lounge on the April 20th, so that's the Thursday, from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then Blythe will be in the Arena Hall, and that'll be on the 21st, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we can certainly send out an email with those, with the specific information as well, just so everyone has it.
So I'm sure if we do get questions, we're going to be able to pass them on to you and whatnot. And because I know a lot came out at the last public consultation, so for sure. Okay, Councillor Palmer, please.
Yeah, thank you, Reeve. Hannah, this is in Report 3. It's that the draft with changes, with the text changes.
Yes.
It's page 24, and the item is farm, brewery, winery, things like that. So it was off farm business stuff options, and it states the product produced, I guess, must be produced from the crop grown on the farm. So I'm having trouble with the wording, because for a brewery, for instance, like perhaps you could grow some of the grains, but it takes hops too, and hops don't go very well here. So the wording's wrong. It should be changed.
Okay. Yeah, through the Reeve, I think, certainly the intent is that it's supposed to be value added to what's actually grown on your property or in the local area, but I think we can look at adding flexibility.
Well, they're going to do it
language.
anyways.
Exactly.
All right?
Yes, yep.
May I have a follow-up, or we can go to the Deputy Reeve if he wishes?
No, go ahead. Go.
Okay, thank you. It's item 4.11.2, and it's Ag 1 -2. And again, I've harped on this. It mentions, it limits the nutrient limits on that particular type of property, and you can't, because you already deleted 4.7, which was the nutrient management plan, because it's default, right?
Exactly.
So it should come into play here as well. okay?
Yes, through the roof. I would also agree with that. I think
All right.
that's one that we may have overlooked, but yeah, similar, that's why we removed AG 1-7, right? It's not inoperable. So we're intending to remove all
Great.
those.
Thank you, through you. Yeah, I know it wasn't covered in the, in this report, and there may be that there is no regulations for it. I was curious as to where I would find legislation on if say a commercial or an industrial parcel of land was looking to take the housing into their own hands and want to put in garden suites and such like for temporary housing for their own employees or future employees. Is there any provision in the town, in the Huron County for that, or like, where does that fall under? Because it's not covered in any of the.
Right, yep. So through the Reeve, so for the commercial properties, I know for sure in the core commercial area that already in the zoning bylaw, you're permitted to have a residential unit either above or towards the back. So that just wasn't covered because it wasn't a change. It's already accounted for. For industrial properties, it is a little bit more challenging to permit that as a right, just because a lot of the industrial uses tend to be clustered near other industrial uses. So I'm thinking of the north end of Wingham, is we wouldn't want one industrial operation to be able to put a residential dwelling on their property, and then that would restrict the activities that a neighboring property would have. So for those instances, we would prefer that if someone wants to do something like that, they come in and do a zoning bylaw amendment, and then they would need to do the required studies to account for any neighboring industrial uses, just to make sure they're not sterilizing them.
That's
yeah.
good. Yeah.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Whitfield.
Yeah, through you, Reeve. When does this become a commercial property for the farmer, depending on what you put into your new building on the farm? If you're selling vegetables, you have your garden, you have your greenhouses, and people come in, you have your own store set up, does that become commercial?
So through the Reeve, it would depend what you mean by commercial, like in terms of zoning. No, the zoning wouldn't
Zoning
change. It would
itself.
stay agriculture, provided the main use still continues to be agriculture. So that's why those on-farm diversified uses where you can have like a produce stand or retail store or something like that, that it should be smaller scale so that you're not having large general retail on your agricultural property.
As you said before, though, a hairdressing shop, you could add that on too.
Correct.
And that's really nothing to do with farming itself.
Yes, through the reef. So yeah, I would agree with that. I think in those cases, it's just about keeping them as small as possible. So for example, in Wingham, if you had a residential property, you would still be permitted to have a small hairdressing shop. The intent of those permissions were that if someone wanted to do a small business, that they have the flexibility to be able to do that in their home. And then the intent is if your business grows or gets larger, then you would move into a commercial area.
That's what I mean, but like on a farm, you have your large buildings and everything on the farm.
Yeah.
And you have people coming in and out. I'm just wondering where it becomes commercial and not commercial or still agriculture. If you set up
Right.
a little repair shop in there too, like you partly farm equipment or other equipment, whereabouts does it become commercial?
Right, yes, so through the reef, so that's where we have the things like so the home industry would be something like an auto repair. So there are restrictions in the bylaw in terms of the size for that. I don't know on the top of my head, but I can certainly look it up. So there's limitations in the zoning bylaw that intend to reduce the scale. We want to provide flexibility to people to have those businesses, but again, the challenge is right. Sometimes they get too big, and that's certainly not the intent. But we wouldn't, for example, be supportive of someone rezoning to have a large commercial business on the property that wasn't able to be accessory to agriculture, or that would be general retail.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Any other questions for Hannah? Not seeing any. I look forward to what goes on in April, for sure, at these things. So
Right.
that'll be good. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you.
that the council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives the first draft of the proposed zoning bylaw amendment and text and mapping changes for information, and further, that the council directs staff to circulate public notices for open houses to be held on April 20th and April 21st, and further, that council directs staff to send notices to landowners with proposed zoning changes. May I have a mover? Councillor Palmer, seconder, Councillor Whitfield, all in favor? Carried. CL 2023-05, appointment of line fence viewers. Are there any questions for Clerk Lamb? Seeing none, that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives the report of the clerk dated March 20th, 23 regarding the appointment of line fence viewers for information purposes, and further that the council appoints Adam Ireland, Stuart Skinner, Vaughn Toll, and Randy Scott as alternate as line fence viewers for the Township of North Huron for 2022 to 2026 term of council, and further that council directs clerk to prepare a bylaw for April 3rd, 2023 regular council meeting to appoint the line fence viewers for the corporation of the Township of North Huron for the 2022-2026 term of council. I have a mover, Councillor McBurney, Councillor Van Henderson, all in favor? Carried. Finance, 2023-08, Blythe Fire Department Donations Reserve Account Payout. Are there any questions for Director Towns? Seeing none, that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives a report from the Director of Finance Treasurer dated March 20th, 2023 regarding the Blythe Fire Department Donations Reserve Account for information purposes. And further, that Council directs the Director of Finance Treasurer to pay out the remaining funds, $10,449.13 within the Blythe Fire Department Donations Reserve Account to the Blythe Fire Department Association. And further, that Council directs for the closure of the Blythe Fire Department Donations Reserve Account. I have a mover, Councillor McBurney, Deputy Reeve, Faulkner, all in favor? Carried. Public Works, 2023-07, Cemetery Bylaw Update. Does anybody have any questions for Director Fortney? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Reeve. Greg, the hours for internment there, were you in consultation with the funeral directors and local ones to see if that suits? Everything works there?
Through you, Reeve, Councillor Palmer, yes, that was in consultation at the September 27th meeting of local funeral homes, staff, and monument markers. They all came to that agreement, and that's why this is part of this update.
So everyone's happy, okay.
Thank you. Just a question for Director Fortney. I was just wondering, there's a couple changes in there. It said that you could have 4 burials on top of a coffin, and now it's to 3. Is that doesn't get grandfathered or anything at all? That's
through to you, Reeve. This is a best management practice, and we can certainly change it if council wished us to do so. However, there's no such thing as grandfathering any longer.
Okay.
Once the BAO has approved the bylaw process, the only way we can reopen this up to do it again, would be to do it again, this whole process. So it is a bylaw, but it's also a higher bylaw of sorts because the Bereavement Authority of Ontario is such a substantial ministry in itself.
yes. Thank you. The BAO, yeah, they are higher. Thank you very much. So, any other questions from members? Seeing none, that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby receives a cemetery bylaw update report from the Director of Public Works and Facilities dated March 20th, 23 for information purposes. And further, that the council directs staff to submit the draft cemetery bylaw to the Bereavement Authority of Ontario for consideration and approval. And further, that council directs staff to proceed with the providing of public notice of the filing of the draft cemetery bylaw with the BAO in accordance with the cemetery bylaw filing requirements. May I have a mover? Councillor Whitfield, seconder. Deputy Reeve, Faulkner, all in favor? Carried. Now we go down to 9.1, Reeve Activity Report. I just want to say that there's just a little bit going on at the county level with their budget right now, and it'll be coming out closer in our next meeting, I'd expect. So that's pretty well all I have to say for that. Is there anybody from the council member reports, verbal or written updates from members who sit on boards or committees? Let's start here. Go ahead, Councillor Van Hitterson.
Thank you very much, Reeve. Yes, we had the Midland Valley Conservation Authority meeting. They approved their budget. The levy was approved for this year. They're also turning out an RFP for demolishing the barn at the Nature Center, and they are looking to replace that with a picnic shelter. And donations are welcome. The Maitland Conservation Authority of Conservation Foundation is sending out a request. There's a really nice video on their website that everybody should look at, and they're looking for money. There's a very exciting thing going on there because of the demolition of the barn. There's a colony of little brown bats there, and the Toronto Zoo was in the area, and personnel from Maitland Valley was asking if they could have a look how to take care of the little bats that were in the barn. Now it is determined that that the colony at the Nature Center is the largest maternity colony in the area here. So Toronto Zoo is willing to put up, going with modern times, condos for those little brown bats and supplying money for that. So that's really exciting for North Huron, and to have this this cooperation with the zoo with them. Yeah.
Great. Go ahead, Councillor Wright.
Yeah, I do have an update for homecoming, but is that high-density housing? Just curious.
Yeah, it is. And there
Those
will be
condos.
some single houses too, but I don't know how bats work with that.
Thanks. Yeah, through you, Reeve. Just want to report some good news on homecoming. We do have a couple in town that I've been talking to, and they are willing to take the primary leadership position of that. And so for anyone who's interested, there is a meeting March 30th at the Legion upstairs. That's going to be kind of the re-kickoff of homecoming initiatives. Just want to let everybody know that. Thank you, Reeve.
Thank you. Councillor McBurney?
Yes, through you, Reeve. In regards to CHIP, we're in the process of finalizing our terms of reference. We need to elect a chair and a vice chair for this term. And we're gathering input through the roundtable discussions, discussing from the group to set up our priorities. And that's where we're at with that.
Good. Thank you, Councillor McBurney. Deputy Reeve, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. Okay. Comments by members? Okay. Go ahead, Deputy.
Thank you, through you, Reeve. Yeah, I'd like to just congratulate all the participants in the maple syrup Maple and Huron County festivities over the past weekend. I know our own little village was a bustle with pancake breakfasts and maple taffy demonstrations, and some of the sugar bushes were open for families to come out and see how those things were made. And a lot of the store owners and the confectionery places, the restaurant facilities, all put on maple specials for anyone coming into their facilities during this time, and it was a nice cohesive municipal event that was carried out, I think, very successfully. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. At this time, 9.4.1, request from Councillor Wright.
Yeah, thank you, Reeve. In consultation with the clerk, I'm actually going to withdraw this notice of motion. I've had a look at the plans, and it turns out that they do adequately address the concerns about these assets in the park, that they are actually part of the current scope and will be removed. And as far as the other area to restore the south bank, or the south river bank, it does actually go through this park quite a ways. So I'm satisfied the current plans address these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bylaws. Bylaw number 17, 2023, appointment of members to the boards and committees. Do I have a mover? Councillor Van Hitterson, seconder. Councillor Whitfield, all in favor? Carried. 10.2 bylaw number 18, 2023, asset disposal transfer policy. Do you have a mover? Deputy Reeve? Councillor McBurney? All in favor? Carried. 10.3, bylaw number 19, 2023, Wingham BIA Constitution and Procedural Bylaw. May I have a mover? Councillor Wright? Councillor Whitfield? All in favor? Carried. Number 10.4, bylaw number 2023, Blythe BIA Constitution Procedure Bylaw. May I have a mover? Deputy Reeve, Faulkner, Councillor McBurney, all in favor? Carried. Announcements. Next budget meeting will be held on Monday, March 27th, 2023 at 6 p.m. in the North Huron Town Hall Theatre. The next regular council meeting will be held on Monday, April 3rd, 2023 at 6 p.m. in the North Huron Town Hall Theatre. Next Blythe BIA board meeting will be held on Thursday, March 30th at 8 a.m. at the Blythe and District Community Center. And the next Wingham BIA board meeting will be held on Thursday, April 20th at 6:30 at Hot Stove Lounge at the West Cass Community Complex. Are there any other announcements? Seeing none. Other business? Number 13, closed session and reporting out that the Council of the Township of North Huron hereby proceeds at
8:11 p.m.
8:11 p.m. to an in-camera session closed to the public under Section 239 2B of the Municipal Act to discuss the following: personal matters about an identified individual, including municipal or local board employees, and further, that County Clerk Susan Cronin remain in attendance. We'll take a 5-minute break.
I need a mover in a second.
Mover, please. Councillor Van Hitterson, followed by Councillor Whitfield. All in favor? Carried. Okay, at this time, we'll